A widow stood alone at the edge of a frozen creek, her hands buried in cold red clay, the wide frontier sky stretching vast and indifferent above her. She did not know, in that quiet September morning, that the worst winter of her life was already coming. She did not know that before the snow fell, she would lose nearly everything. And she did not know that the man who had called her cabin a fool's grave would one day kneel in the snow outside its door, supported by his wife, begging to be let in. But that moment was still months away. Her name was Sigrid Voss. She was 36 years old. Her hair had once been the color of summer wheat, but grief and wind had woven silver through it until it looked like something between gold and ash. Her hands were calloused from work that had never stopped. Her eyes held the gray of northern seas. And lately, something else. Something that looked like determination wrapped around a sorrow too deep to measure. 7 weeks earlier, her husband Eric had been alive. 7 weeks earlier, they had stood together on this same land, looking at the half-finished cabin that would become their home. He had put his arm around her shoulders and said the words she still heard in her sleep. "We will build something here, Sigrid. Something that lasts." Then the fever came. 3 days of burning and shaking. 3 days of watching the man she had followed across an ocean fade like morning mist burning off the mountains. He was gone before she could prepare herself. Before she could say the things she had always assumed there would be time to say. She buried him on a Wednesday. She went back to work on Thursday. Because that was what you did. That was what mountain women did. Her son Leif was 14 years old and already trying to carry a man's weight on a boy's shoulders. Her daughter Britta was 11, sharp-eyed, quiet, and the only one among them who could read the old Scandinavian script that filled her grandmother's journal. Bear, their border collie, lay in the grass nearby, watching Sigrid work with the patient attention of a creature who understood more than he should. He had stopped eating for 3 days after Eric died. He still slept beside the grave some nights. Sigrid was so focused on the clay that she didn't notice the ash bucket tipping until it was too late. It fell without drama. A soft thump, a slow bloom of gray spreading through the red clay like smoke dissolving into fog. She froze, not because the accident was dangerous, not because it changed anything important, but because waste, any waste, was something she had never permitted herself. Time wasted. Clay wasted. A morning's work muddied by a single moment of carelessness. She stared at the gray streaks spreading through the red. She could scrape it out. She could walk back to the creek and gather fresh clay, though her knees already ached from the morning's labor. Or she could remember. Eric used to repeat something his mother Astrid had said so often it had become a kind of prayer in their household. Never throw anything away until you understand what it is. Sigrid pressed her palms into the mixture and began to work it again. The texture was different beneath her fingers, grainier, stiffer, strange in a way she couldn't name. She kept working, folding the ash deeper into the clay, until the two became one thing that was neither and both. When she was done, she spread a handful onto a split pine board. Then she prepared a second board, pure clay, unmixed, and set both on the south-facing slope where the sun reached longest and the night frost reached hardest. She didn't expect the accident to matter. She had more pressing problems than a tipped bucket. The cabin was half finished. Winter was coming. And somewhere beyond the mountains, a man named Conrad Voss was already making plans. Conrad was Eric's older brother. He had never approved of Eric's decision to leave the city, never understood why anyone would trade civilization for wilderness. When word of Eric's death reached him, he had sent a letter, full of condolences that read like legal documents. "The land deed is in Eric's name," he had written. "As his surviving brother, I have certain claims. A woman alone with 2 children cannot possibly maintain a homestead through winter. I will arrive to discuss the matter." Discuss. As if Eric's dream were something that could be transferred on a piece of paper. Conrad arrived in late summer, just as he had promised. He stood in the doorway of the half-finished cabin, looking at the bare logs and the dirt floor, and the 2 children who stared at him with their father's eyes. He looked at all of it with the calm assessment of a man who believed he had already won. "You have until spring," he said. "If you cannot prove this homestead is viable, you will sign the land over to me. It is for the best, Sigrid. Everyone knows what happens to women alone in the wilderness." Sigrid had not argued. She had not cried. She had looked at him with those gray eyes and said the only words she had. "You will see." Now it was September. The cabin walls were up. The roof was on. But the real work had not yet begun. The work of making those walls hold against the cold that was already gathering in the high passes, waiting. That evening, after the children were asleep, Sigrid sat by the fire with Astrid's journal open in her lap. It was cracked and worn, filled with handwriting she could only partially read. Eric's mother had pressed it into his hands the day they left for the frontier, speaking rapidly in the old language, too fast for Sigrid to follow, her face tight with something that looked like urgency. Eric had promised to explain later. He had promised to teach Sigrid everything his mother knew about surviving in cold places. He had never gotten the chance. Now the journal was all she had of Astrid's wisdom, page after page of cramped, old-fashioned script. And there was something else, too. Something Sigrid had noticed the very first time she opened it, in the raw days after the funeral, when she had been looking for something, anything, to hold on to. Near the middle of the journal, a page had been torn out. Not torn carelessly, not ripped in anger or haste. The edge was too clean for that. A precise, deliberate removal, as though someone had taken great care to leave no trace. Just the faint ghost of a page, and the jagged spine where it had once been bound. Sigrid had stared at that empty space for a long time. She had turned the surrounding pages carefully, looking for any clue about what had been written there. She found nothing. She would not learn the truth about that torn page until the storm had already swallowed the valley. But on that September evening, sitting beside the fire with a journal in her hands and the night pressing cold against the cabin walls, she ran her fingertip along the torn edge and felt something she couldn't name. Not fear, not grief. Something older and quieter than either of those. She turned to the pages she could read, the ones Britta had been slowly translating for her, evening by evening, the girl's lips moving carefully through the old script. There was a passage near the back, written in ink that looked fresher than the rest. Ash and clay. 1 to 3. It will hold. Sigrid didn't understand what it meant yet. She didn't understand the ratio, or the method, or the centuries of knowledge packed into those 7 words. But something in her chest recognized the phrase the way you recognize a melody you haven't heard since childhood. Not with your mind, but somewhere deeper. She closed the journal. She looked at the walls around her. Bare logs. Gaps she hadn't yet sealed. A cabin that was shelter but not yet safe. Then she did something she had not done before. She turned the journal over and ran her fingers along the back cover, along the edge where the leather met the board beneath. It was an old habit, inherited from her own mother, who had always said that what a person hides, they hide close to the spine. Her fingertips found nothing, just leather, worn smooth with age and handling. She set the journal down. Perhaps she had imagined it. That small sense of something not quite right about the back cover. Perhaps it was only grief, making mysteries where there were none. She let it go. Then she looked at her hands, still stained faintly gray from the morning's accident, from the ash that had fallen into the clay. She whispered the words to no one at all. Ash doesn't argue with cold. Ash remembers. She didn't know yet why she said it. She didn't know yet what it meant. But she would. The test boards sat on the south-facing slope for 10 days. Sigrid checked them every morning, the way a farmer checks the sky before planting. Not with hope exactly, but with the quiet attention of someone who has learned that the world will tell you what you need to know, if you are patient enough to listen. In the first week, she noticed nothing. Both boards dried to a similar hardness. Both developed the same matte surface under the pale autumn sun. They looked identical. They felt nearly identical. And for 7 days, Sigrid allowed herself to wonder if she had been foolish to believe that an accident, a tipped bucket, a gray streak through red clay, could mean anything at all. Then the cold nights came. The pure clay board cracked first. A thin line appeared along one edge, almost too small to see. Then another line, then another. Within 3 days, the surface looked like a dry riverbed, fractured and crumbling, the kind of material that would fall away from a wall the moment real winter arrived. The ash clay board had no cracks. None. Sigrid picked it up and turned it over in her hands. The surface was smooth, firm. When she pressed her thumbnail into it, the material resisted. She pressed harder. Nothing. She could not find a single weakness anywhere. Not along the edges, not at the corners, not in the center where she had applied the mixture thickest. She held the board for a long time, feeling its weight, its quiet solidity, its promise. Then she said aloud, to no one at all, "It holds." That evening, she sat beside the fire with Britta. The journal lay open between them on the table, the leather cover soft with age, the pages yellowed and fragile. Sigrid pointed to a passage near the back, the one she had found weeks ago, the one she hadn't been able to stop thinking about. "Read it again," she said. "All of it. Slowly." Britta leaned closer, her lips moving as she worked through the old script. The girl had her father's concentration, that particular stillness that came over Eric whenever something truly mattered. Watching it in her daughter's face made Sigrid's chest ache in a way she had learned to breathe through. "She writes about a winter," Britta said carefully. "A terrible one. She says many people died across the region." She traced her finger along the faded lines, but in her village, people survived in 3 cabins. They survived because of the ash and clay mixture. 1 part ash to 3 parts clay. She paused. "She says it becomes hard like pottery when it dries. She says it holds heat better than anything else." Sigrid felt something move through her, something older than surprise. "Is there more?" Britta turned the page. "She says her own grandmother learned this from her grandmother. She says the knowledge goes back a long time, maybe longer than anyone remembers. She looked up, and her eyes held a question she was almost afraid to ask. Mama, Papa was going to teach you, wasn't he? That's why Grandmother gave him the journal. Sigrid nodded. She didn't trust herself to speak. He wanted you to know, Britta said. He wanted us all to know. Sigrid pulled her daughter close and held her for a long time, crying for the husband she had lost, for the mother-in-law she had barely known, for the gift they had both left behind in the pages of a battered leather journal. Then she dried her eyes, straightened her back, and went to find her mixing bucket. Because that was what mountain women did. She tested for another month, following Astrid's instructions exactly, adjusting one variable at a time with the careful patience of someone who understood that shortcuts were just a slower way to fail. Life helped her dig clay from the creek bank, hauling it back in the small wooden sledge Eric had built during their first summer. The boy was growing into his strength now, his shoulders broader, his hands developing the calluses of a working man. He did not complain. He did not ask questions about the purpose of each trip, each load, each careful measurement. He simply did whatever his mother needed, hour after hour, with the quiet steadiness of someone who had decided that grief was something you carried while you worked, not something you put down and examined. Britta collected ash from the stove each morning, sifting it through an old flour sieve to remove the chunks of unburned charcoal. She read more of the journal each evening, translating new details that Astrid had recorded over what must have been decades of careful observation. Only use ash from hardwood, Britta translated one night, her finger moving carefully along the page. Oak is best, maple is good. She says never use pine or cottonwood. The ash is too weak. Sigrid adjusted her methods. The wall must be wet before the plaster goes on, Britta read another evening. Dry wood steals water from the clay. Wet wood accepts it. They become one thing. Sigrid began soaking each section of wall before she applied the mixture, working in the early morning when the air was cold and still and the rest of the world had not yet begun to make demands of her. Leave space at the top, Britta said on a third evening, her voice carrying the quiet satisfaction of a child who has discovered she is genuinely useful. Fill it with dried grass. The logs will move when the seasons change. If the plaster goes all the way up, it will crack when the wood moves. Sigrid left a gap at the top of each wall section and stuffed it with prairie grass she had gathered and dried through the last weeks of summer. The ratio that worked best was exactly what Astrid had written. 1 part ash to 3 parts clay. Too much ash and the mixture became brittle, crumbling under pressure. Too little, and it cracked like the original test board. But 1 to 3 was perfect, solid and enduring, the way certain things are perfect when generations of trial and error have finally found the right answer. They worked as a family, the 3 of them, with Bear lying beside the mixing area each day in a patch of weak autumn sun, his chin resting on his paws, watching them with the steady attention of a creature who understood that something important was happening even if he couldn't say what. The first skeptic arrived on an October morning. Harlan Croft was 52 years old, the most powerful rancher in the valley. A man who had survived decades of frontier winters and believed that survival gave him the right to judge everyone who had not. He was broad-shouldered, weathered, and accustomed to being listened to. He rode his bay horse along the creek path, slowing when he saw Sigrid working beside the cabin, her hands covered in gray-brown paste, her apron stained, her focus absolute. He dismounted without being invited. "What in God's name are you putting on those walls?" His voice carried the particular edge of a man who had already made up his mind. Sigrid did not stop working. She pressed another handful of plaster into the gap between two logs, smoothing it with the practiced motion she had developed over weeks of preparation. Harlan walked closer. He stared at the mixture in her bucket. He picked up a hardened scrap from the ground and turned it over in his fingers with exaggerated skepticism. "Is that ash? You're mixing fireplace sweepings into your walls?" Sigrid moved to the next section. "Wet the wood. Apply. Smooth." "Your husband was a decent man," Harlan said, and his tone made the words into something that wasn't quite a compliment. "But grief does strange things to a person's judgment. That nonsense will crumble before Christmas. Those children of yours will freeze because their mother decided to play at building instead of finding proper shelter." Sigrid finally looked at him. Her gray eyes held no anger, no pleading, no fear. "You will see," she said. Harlan laughed, a short, hard sound, and rode away toward town. And Sigrid went back to work. She had known what would happen next. She had grown up in small communities, had lived in them all her life. She knew how contempt spread from one person to another, how one man's dismissal could become an entire community's settled opinion. By nightfall, the whole valley would know what the widow was doing to her walls. They came one after another over the following weeks, each bringing their own particular variety of doubt. Dr. Edmund Shaw arrived claiming scientific interest, though his expression made clear that what he was actually interested in was confirming what he already believed. He was in his mid-40s, educated back east, proud of his training in ways that had never fully softened into something useful. He examined the plaster mixture with the performance of a man conducting an important experiment, running it through his fingers, frowning at it, shaking his head with theatrical regret. "I studied chemistry, Mrs. Voss," he said. "Wood ash contains potassium carbonate. It weakens structural bonds. This plaster will disintegrate within weeks. It is elementary science. You will see," Sigrid said. He left muttering something about superstition and the unfortunate effects of isolation on the undereducated mind. Reverend Miles Holt came on a Sunday, his Bible under his arm, his face arranged into an expression of pastoral concern that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I've heard reports," he said carefully, looking at the half-plastered walls, "about the methods you're using. Old-world methods." He paused. Some in the congregation have expressed concern. "It is my mother-in-law's knowledge," Sigrid said. "She was a Christian woman who lived through winters that would have killed most men." The Reverend did not look convinced. He left without offering to pray with her. Young Wade Tanner rode by on a Saturday with a group of friends, all of them loud and restless and looking for something to laugh at. He was 19 years old, the kind of young man who needed an audience to feel brave. "Hey, widow!" he shouted from horseback, his friends already laughing. "Building yourself a mud castle? I'll give it till Christmas. Anyone want to take the other side?" No one did. They rode away still laughing, and their mockery hung in the cold air long after the sound of hoofbeats had faded. Through it all, Sigrid kept working. She did not argue. She did not explain herself. She did not waste energy on people who had already decided what they thought. She simply pressed her hands into ash and clay, and let the walls speak for themselves, which they would in time. She was certain of that the way she was certain of very few things. But certainty, she had learned, did not make the waiting easier. The first person who looked at her work without contempt was old Silas Greer. He was 78 years old, a trapper who had worked these mountains since before most of the current residents had been born. His eyes were clouding with age. His hands trembled slightly when he walked, but his mind remained sharp as a skinning knife, and he had lived long enough to stop caring what other people thought about what he said. He came on foot one morning, moving slowly up the path with a cane carved from a piece of antler. He stood for a long time, watching Sigrid work, watching the way she mixed, the way she wet the logs before applying, the way she scored the first coat before adding the second. Then he spoke. "My grandmother came from Cornwall," he said. "She came to this country as a young woman with nothing but what she could carry." He paused, his cloudy eyes moving over the walls. "She did something like this. Mixed ash into the clay for her cottage walls. Told me it was the old way." He was quiet for a moment. That cottage stood 80 years. Outlived her children. He looked at Sigrid directly. "Don't listen to Harlan Croft. He's lived in this valley a long time and learned nothing from it." He turned and walked away, slowly, back down the path. Sigrid stood still for a long moment after he left. Then she smiled, the first real smile in a very long time. 3 days later, Nora Lindqvist came. She was a Norwegian widow, 48 years old, living on a small homestead to the north. She had heard the stories about the strange building methods, and she had come to see for herself. She stood beside the cabin wall and ran her fingertips along the hardened plaster, and her face changed the way faces change when they recognize something from home. "Askelair," she whispered. "That's what we called it. In Bergen. My mother used this. My grandmother, too." She looked at Sigrid with eyes that held the understanding of women who had lost too much and kept going anyway. "They called my mother crazy, too," Nora said. "Right up until the winter her walls held and everyone else's cracked." She stayed for several hours, helping Sigrid work, sharing stories in the easy way of people who have discovered they come from the same place, even if they have never met before. When she left, she made a promise. "If your walls hold," she said, "I want to learn. I want to teach my daughter." "They will hold," Sigrid said, "and you will learn." It was around this time that Bear found them, or rather, Bear was found. Leif spotted him first, early one morning near the dump at the edge of the property. A border collie, black and white, so thin his ribs showed through his coat, lying in the mud with the exhausted stillness of an animal that has given up expecting anything from the world. "Mama." Leif's voice was careful. "Can we keep him?" Sigrid looked at the dog. The dog did not look back. He simply lay there, past the point of hoping. "We barely have enough for ourselves," she said. "I'll hunt more," Leif said. "I'll set more traps. He won't be a burden." He paused. "He looks like he needs a reason." Sigrid understood that feeling better than she wanted to admit. "1 week," she said. "If he earns his place, he stays." Bear earned his place in 3 days. He began sleeping beside the door at night, his ears alert to every sound from outside. He growled once, low and certain, when a stranger's horse came too close to the cabin in the dark, and the horse turned away. He stayed beside Britta when she carried water from the creek, matching her pace exactly, never pulling ahead, never falling behind. On the fourth morning, he brought a rabbit to the doorstep, not quite alive, not quite dead, and set it down carefully at Sigrid's feet, then sat back and waited. Sigrid looked at the rabbit. She looked at the dog. "All right," she said. "You stay." It was during the second phase of building, the long middle weeks of October, that Fletcher Ashworth appeared. He was the valley's blacksmith, a widower, 42 years old, with a stillness about him that was different from the stillness of grief. More like the stillness of a man who had decided long ago that quiet was more honest than noise. He showed up one morning while Sigrid was working on the north wall, carrying a set of tools she hadn't asked for. "Your door hinges," he said, nodding toward the cabin entrance. "They're going to fail before winter. The wood's already pulling." He held up the tools. "Won't take long." She hadn't noticed the hinges. She had been too focused on the walls. "I didn't ask for help," she said. "No," he agreed. "You didn't." He fixed the hinges without being invited inside, working quietly and efficiently, and left without asking for anything. The next morning, there was a small loaf of bread on her doorstep, wrapped in cloth, still faintly warm. Britta noticed. She said nothing to her mother, but later, when she thought no one was listening, she whispered something to Leif that made him glance toward the door with an expression caught between surprise and cautious hope. Sigrid pretended not to hear. She had walls to finish. The crisis, when it came, arrived quietly, the way the worst things always do. It began with Leif's cough. A small thing at first, a roughness in his throat that Sigrid noticed at dinner one evening and filed away as something to watch. By morning, it had settled deeper, and by the following evening he was feverish, his face flushed and his eyes too bright, the kind of brightness that comes from heat rather than happiness. Sigrid moved through the night with the focused calm of someone who cannot afford to panic. She heated water. She made the broth her own mother had made when Sigrid was small, thin and clear, with dried herbs crumbled into it that she had gathered and stored through the autumn for exactly this kind of need. She sat beside Leif's bed and kept the fire burning and did not sleep. At some point in the deepest part of the night, she went to tend the stove and found that the wood was almost gone. She had been so focused on the walls, on the clay, on the endless work of preparation, that she had let the woodpile run lower than she'd realized. There was enough for the night, barely. And when she went to light an extra candle to see better, to check the color of Leif's face, to make sure the fever was not climbing, she found the matchbox nearly empty. 3 matches. She sat with the box in her hand for a long moment in the dark, listening to the sound of her son breathing, listening to the wind beginning to move outside. 3 matches. She would need fire through the night. She would need it through tomorrow. She had been careful with everything. She had measured the ash and the clay to the exact ratio. She had tested and adjusted and prepared, and she had still somehow let the matches run down to 3. She did not cry. She thought about crying, but there wasn't time. She went to Leif's bedside, tucked the blanket more firmly around him, and then quietly, so she wouldn't wake Britta, she took the small store of food she had set aside for herself the following day and put it with the children's supply instead. She had done this before, over the past weeks, when things ran short. She had told herself it didn't matter. She was stronger than she looked. She could go a day without eating, and it would cost her nothing that mattered. She struck the first match. Her hands were steadier than she expected. The flame caught. She touched it carefully to the tinder she had laid, and the small fire grew, and the cabin began to warm again around her sleeping children. She sat back on her heels and exhaled. In the morning, Leaf looked at her hands where she was working, slightly unsteady, moving with the careful precision of someone who was managing something. And he frowned. "Mama, why do your hands shake?" She looked down at her own hands. She hadn't realized it showed. "They're cold," she said. It was a cold night. He watched her for another moment with his father's eyes, and she could see that he didn't entirely believe her. But he was 14, and he understood somehow that there were things his mother was carrying that she wasn't ready to put down yet. "I'll get more wood today," he said, "and I'll set 2 more traps. You should rest. Your fever—" "It broke," he said. "I feel all right." He didn't look entirely all right, but he looked determined, and in her family, that had always counted for more. The fever broke fully by afternoon. Leaf was up by evening, moving slowly but steadily, splitting wood with the careful economy of someone who has learned not to waste effort. Bear stayed close to him all day, as if the dog had appointed himself personal physician and was not yet satisfied with the patient's progress. Sigrid watched her son from the doorway of the cabin and felt something shift in her chest. A complicated feeling that was part relief, part grief, part gratitude for the child who was growing right in front of her into someone she hadn't fully met yet. Then Conrad came back. He arrived in the last week of October, on a morning when the sky was the color of old pewter, and the first real cold had settled into the valley like a permanent resident. He brought a man with him this time, a lawyer from the nearest large town, carrying a leather satchel and the careful expression of someone being paid to say difficult things pleasantly. Conrad had the same measured courtesy he always wore, the same well-cut coat, the same manner of a man who considered every situation from the position of someone who had already won. He looked at the cabin, the plastered walls, the steep roof, the solid door with its repaired hinges, and his expression shifted slightly before he controlled it. "You've made progress," he said. "We have," Sigrid agreed. "However," he nodded to the lawyer, who opened the satchel. "I've had the property assessed. Under territorial law, a structure must meet certain standards to qualify as a viable habitation. The assessment raises some questions about whether this structure meets those standards." Sigrid waited. "There's also the matter," Conrad continued, and now his voice dropped slightly, took on a quality that was almost gentle, the way a blade can seem almost gentle before it cuts, "of the children's welfare. A mother who is living in an unqualified structure, who is struggling to maintain basic provisions, who is, by all accounts, conducting herself in ways the community finds unconventional. Such a mother may find herself facing questions about her fitness as a guardian." The word landed in the cabin like a stone dropped into still water. Guardian! He was threatening to take the children. Sigrid did not move. She did not speak for a long moment. She looked at Conrad, at his careful eyes, at the lawyer behind him, at the whole constructed apparatus of his power. And she understood exactly what he was doing, and exactly why. "You have until spring," Conrad said. "I trust you will make the right decision." He turned to go, then paused as if remembering something. "Oh, and I noticed your son is about the right age to begin a proper education. The city has excellent schools. If you found yourself unable to maintain the homestead, I could arrange for both children to receive the kind of opportunities this wilderness simply cannot provide." He left before she could answer, which was precisely what he intended. That night, after the children were asleep, Sigrid sat at the table alone. The lamp burned low. The fire had settled into coals. Bear lay beside the door, his ears moving occasionally toward sounds outside, his eyes half open with the vigilant rest of a guardian on duty. On the table in front of her was the deed transfer document that Conrad's lawyer had left behind. A form, a few lines, a place for her signature. She picked up the pen. She sat with it in her hand for a very long time. If she signed, Conrad would get the land. He would get what he had come for. But he would withdraw the threat about the children. He had implied as much, in the careful language of a man who never says directly what he means. The children would be warm. They would be fed. They would be safe in ways that she could not currently guarantee, not with certainty, not with winter coming, and the woodpile never quite full enough, and 3 matches in a box. She thought about Leif's hands, reddened from work. She thought about Britta's face bent over the journal in the firelight, translating dead words back into living knowledge. She thought about Eric, who had stood on this land and said, "We will build something here, something that lasts." She thought about the test board sitting on the south-facing slope, smooth and uncracked while everything around it had given way. Bear lifted his head. He looked at the paper on the table. Then he looked at her. He set his chin down on top of the deed transfer document and exhaled slowly, a long, warm, deliberate breath, and closed his eyes. Sigrid looked at him for a moment. Then she set down the pen. She took the paper from under the dog's chin, carefully, so as not to wake him. She folded it once, then she tore it in half. Then she tore those halves again. She dropped the pieces into the coals. She watched them burn. "All right," she said quietly, to Eric, to Astrid, to the women who had passed this knowledge forward across generations for exactly this kind of moment. "All right, we finished the walls." In the days that followed, something shifted in the cabin. Not dramatically, not all at once, but gradually. The way mornings shift in early autumn, becoming different without you being able to say exactly when the change happened. A small mirror appeared on the wall, salvaged from a broken frame. A shelf of rough-cut pine held their few books and Astrid's journal in its place of honor. There was a routine now. Fire before dawn, porridge, the morning's work divided among the 3 of them with the efficiency of people who had learned each other's rhythms. Bear's water bowl sat beside the stove, and the sound of him lapping at it in the morning had become, without Sigrid quite noticing, one of the sounds that meant safety. Fletcher Ashworth came again, twice in 1 week, then a 3rd time, each visit with some reasonable pretext that grew slightly less convincing as time went on. A bolt that needed tightening, a question about the roof angle and whether it would hold heavy snow, a delivery of iron hooks that Sigrid hadn't ordered but found, on reflection, quite useful. He didn't stay long. He didn't push himself into conversation, but he was there, and his being there had a quality that was different from the skeptic's attention, different from Conrad's scrutiny, a quality that Sigrid recognized distantly from long ago, and did not yet allow herself to name. Britta noticed everything, as she always did, and said nothing, as she sometimes did. Leif, for his part, had returned to full health, and now threw himself into the work with an energy that occasionally alarmed Sigrid, who had to remind herself that 14-year-old boys were built to work themselves to the edge and then recover overnight. He had taken over the woodpile entirely, splitting logs in the late afternoon, with the focused efficiency of someone who has decided that this particular task is his personal responsibility and will not be delegated. One evening, Britta looked up from the journal and said without preamble, "Mama, are we poor?" Sigrid stopped what she was doing. She looked around the cabin, at the small mirror, at the books on the shelf, at the fire burning steady in the iron stove, at her son bent over his whittling by the lamp, at her daughter with ink on her fingers from tracing old words, at Bear asleep in his warm spot by the door. "No, sweetheart," she said. "We are rich in what matters." Britta considered this for a moment, then turned back to the journal with the satisfied air of someone who has received an answer worth keeping. Sigrid went back to work. The walls were nearly done, and somewhere in the high passes to the north, the cold was gathering, patient, enormous, indifferent, waiting for its moment. But Sigrid didn't know that yet. She knew only this: the walls were nearly done, and they would hold. Ash doesn't argue with cold, she thought, pressing her hand flat against the plaster and feeling its solidity beneath her palm. Ash remembers. The mending came first, not the dramatic kind, not the kind that announces itself with gestures and declarations, the quiet kind, the kind that happens in the margins of ordinary days when you are too busy to notice it happening until you look up one evening and realize that something broken has, without ceremony, become whole. The cabin was finished, every wall sealed, every gap filled, every surface smooth and hard and ready. Sigrid stood outside in the thin, late autumn light and looked at what the three of them had built, what Eric had started and what she had finished, with ash and clay and the accumulated wisdom of women she had never met but somehow knew. It was not large. It was not beautiful in any way that Harlan Croft would recognize, but it was solid, and it was theirs. And when she pressed her palm flat against the plastered wall, she felt no give, no weakness, no cold seeping through from the other side. She left her hand there for a long moment. Then she went inside to make dinner. The weeks that followed were the quietest they had known since Eric died. Not peaceful. Exactly. Quiet was never truly peaceful when there was still so much to prepare for. But the urgency of building had settled into something else. The steadier urgency of waiting. The wood was stacked. The walls were sealed. The root cellar was as full as she could make it. There was nothing left to do but be ready. Sigrid found that she did not know how to simply be ready. She had spent so many months in motion that stillness felt like a warning. She started finding small tasks, rechecking the plaster, adjusting the grass stuffed into the wall gaps, sharpening tools that were already sharp. Leaf watched her without comment. Britta watched her too, with those careful eyes that missed nothing. And then, on a morning that felt no different from any other, the tension broke, not from outside, but from within. It was Britta who found the scrap of paper. She wasn't looking for it. She was tidying the shelf where Leaf kept his few belongings, the carved wooden horse Eric had made him, a smooth river stone he'd carried since childhood, a folded square of cloth that had been his father's handkerchief, when a small piece of paper slipped from between the folds of cloth and drifted to the floor. Britta picked it up without thinking. She read it before she understood what she was reading. It was in Conrad's handwriting. She recognized it from the legal documents he had left behind. Brief, precise, the handwriting of a man who never used two words when one would do. The offer stands through winter. Education, prospects, a proper future. Come to the Eastern office when you are ready. Tell no one. Britta stood very still for a moment. Then she folded the paper carefully, set it back where she had found it, walked to the door of the cabin, and stood there for a moment looking at her mother, who was outside at the woodpile, stacking logs with the methodical focus she brought to everything. Britta didn't say anything that evening. She needed to think. But Sigrid noticed, the way mothers notice things that happen below the surface of the ordinary, in the register of small wrongnesses that don't announce themselves but accumulate. Britta was too quiet at dinner. Leif was too careful not to look at his sister. The air between them had a texture it hadn't had that morning. She waited. She gave them the night. She gave them the following morning, watching Leif split wood with an extra intensity that had nothing to do with the logs, watching Britta turn pages in the journal without actually reading them. By midday, she couldn't wait anymore. "Leif," she said. He set down the axe. "What did Conrad offer you?" The silence that followed was the kind that confirms everything. Leif turned slowly. He was 14, and he had his father's face. And in that moment, he looked very young and very old at the same time. Caught between the boy who had wanted to protect his mother from an impossible choice and the young man who was beginning to understand that protection sometimes required honesty rather than silence. "Education," he said finally. "A school in the city. A proper one." He swallowed. "He said I could become something. A lawyer, maybe. Or a doctor." "And what did you tell him?" Another silence, longer this time. "I told him no." Leif met her eyes. "I was going to tell you. I kept meaning to tell you. But I didn't want you to worry." And then more time passed, and it felt harder to say the longer I waited. He exhaled. "I'm sorry, Mama." Sigrid looked at her son for a long moment. She had prepared herself, in the walk from the woodpile to this conversation, for many possible versions of what she might feel. Anger, certainly. Betrayal, perhaps. The particular hurt of discovering that the person you thought you were protecting had been quietly protecting you in return, in all the wrong ways. What she had not prepared for was the grief. Not for herself, for him, for the 14-year-old boy who had stood in front of Conrad Voss with his smooth city coat and his lawyer's voice and the weight of adult authority behind every word, and said no, alone, without telling anyone, without asking for help, without knowing whether he was making the right choice or simply the loyal one. She crossed the distance between them and held him the way she had when he was small, when holding was still something he allowed without embarrassment, and felt him hold her back with the same fierceness. And for a little while, neither of them said anything. Britta, who had appeared silently in the doorway, watched them with wet eyes and did not interrupt. When Sigrid finally stepped back, she looked at both her children. This boy, this girl, these two people who were becoming, right in front of her, people she had not fully met yet. "We do not keep secrets from each other," she said. "Not anymore. Whatever comes, we face it together." Leif nodded. Britta nodded. "Good." Sigrid straightened, wiped her face with the back of her hand. "Now, help me with these walls." That evening, by the fire, Britta returned to the journal. She had been working for weeks now at the back pages, the ones written in a darker, fresher ink, added years after the main body of the text, as if Astrid had come back to the journal late in her life to add things she had not known when she was younger. There was something different about the handwriting in these sections. More urgent, less careful. The penmanship of someone writing quickly, as if afraid of running out of time. Britta had been circling around one particular page for several evenings, finding reasons each time to stop, to say her eyes were tired, to suggest they continue tomorrow. She had recognized, even before she understood the words, that whatever was written there was different from the rest. "Mama," she said. Sigrid looked up from her mending. "I need to show you something." She had been working on restoring the torn page, not the original, which was gone forever, but a reconstruction. Over the past weeks, she had found several tiny fragments lodged in the spine of the journal. Slivers of paper too small to read individually, but which, with patience and lamplight and the particular stubbornness of an 11-year-old who had decided something was possible, she had been slowly assembling like a puzzle on a piece of clean cloth. She had enough now to read most of it. She spread the cloth on the table between them, the tiny paper fragments laid out in careful order, each one barely larger than a fingernail. "The torn page," she said. "I found the pieces in the binding. I've been putting it together for a month." Sigrid stared at the fragments, at the tiny, cramped handwriting that was unmistakably Astrid's. "Can you read it?" Britta leaned close, moving the lamp nearer, her lips moving silently as she worked through the reconstructed text. Then she went very still. "Mama." Her voice was different, careful in the way of someone carrying something fragile. "Papa tore this page out." "How do you know?" "Because she says so. In the page before this one, the one that's still intact, she writes, 'I have told him not to show her this until the walls are built. He will know when the time is right. He is his father's son, and his father always knew when to speak and when to wait.'" Sigrid felt something move through her that she couldn't name. "What does it say?" she asked. "The torn page. What did she write?" Britta read slowly, translating as she went, her voice steady and quiet in the warm cabin while the night pressed cold against the windows. "She writes that once, when she was a young woman, she lived through a winter unlike any other. She says she had never seen anything like it before and hoped never to see it again." Britta paused, tracing a fragment carefully. "She says there were signs before it came. The sky changed color. She says it turned the color of old copper, like a bruise that had been there a long time. She says the birds flew south early and strange, not in their usual patterns. She says the animals knew before the people did. The cattle refused to go into the fields. The horses wouldn't settle." She paused again. "She says, when you see these signs, and if you are living in the high country, you will see them perhaps once in a lifetime, perhaps more. Do not wait. Do not argue with the sky. The walls you have built will be enough if you have built them rightly. Trust them. And when the storm comes, open your door." The fire crackled. Bear lifted his head from his spot beside the stove, looked at Sigrid, then lay back down. "Open your door," Sigrid repeated. "She writes it twice," Britta said, like she wanted to make sure it couldn't be misread. Sigrid sat very still. Eric had taken this page out of the journal. He had set it aside, kept it from her, with the intention of returning it at the right moment. And then the fever had come, and the right moment had passed, and the page had ended up folded inside a handkerchief among Leif's things, carried unconsciously, like a letter waiting to be delivered. "He wanted to tell me himself," she said. "It wasn't a question." "I think so." Britta folded the cloth carefully around the fragments. "I think he wanted to be the one to sit with you and explain it, so you wouldn't be afraid." Sigrid closed her eyes briefly. "Ash doesn't argue with cold," she said quietly. "Ash remembers." It was the following morning that old Silas Greer appeared on the road through the valley, moving slower than usual, and stopped at every cabin he passed to say the same thing. Sigrid was outside when he reached her, splitting kindling in the early light. He stopped at the edge of her property and looked at the sky for a long moment before he looked at her. "I've seen that color twice in my life," he said, without preamble. He was looking at the horizon to the north, where the sky had taken on a quality she hadn't noticed until he pointed to it. A strange, flat light, like the light through old copper, like the sky was holding something back. Both times, the valley lost people. Sigrid looked at the sky. She thought about Astrid's words, reconstructed fragment by fragment on a piece of cloth. The sky changed color, like a bruise that had been there a long time. "How long?" she asked. Silas was quiet for a moment. "Soon," he said. "I don't know the hour, but soon." He moved on down the road. Sigrid went inside. She told the children to finish stacking the wood. She checked every seal on every wall, running her fingers along the plaster the way a surgeon checks a wound, looking for any place where cold might find its way in. She checked the stores in the root cellar, the dried meat, the preserved vegetables, the sacks of grain, and calculated and recalculated, and then went out and traded 3 days' worth of her own labor at the general store for an additional supply of cornmeal. Then she did something that cost her more than any of it. She went to warn the valley. She started with the general store, where a small group of men were gathered around the iron stove, talking about the coming winter in the comfortable way of people who believe they have seen everything winter can do. She explained what she had read, the color of the sky, the behavior of the animals, what Astrid had written, a woman who had lived through exactly this, who had survived it, who had recorded what it looked like before it arrived. The storekeeper listened with the polite, slightly pitying attention of a man who has already decided not to believe what he is hearing. "Animals get restless all the time," he said. "Doesn't mean anything." She went to the Croft Ranch and told Harlan, who looked at the sky and then looked at her and said nothing for a moment. And in that moment, she thought she saw something flicker behind his eyes, something that might have been uncertainty. Then he put it away. "You've got a good cabin, widow," he said. "Enjoy it. Leave the weather prediction to people who've lived here longer." She went to Dr. Shaw, who heard her out and then explained patiently the science of weather patterns and the unreliability of folk observation methods. She went to Reverend Holt, who prayed with her. She had not expected that, and was briefly moved by it, but who also said, gently, that the Lord's timing was not something a person could predict by looking at the sky. She went to every cabin she could reach before the light began to fail. And at the Tanner property, young Wade was splitting wood outside when she approached, bigger than she remembered, his father's build, with his father's way of taking up space. "Mrs. Voss." His tone carried the residue of the boy who had laughed on horseback months ago. He wasn't laughing now, but he wasn't listening either. Come to tell us the sky's the wrong color? You're animals, she said. Look at your horses tonight. If they won't settle, bring them in. He stared at her. The widow's scared of weather, he called back toward the barn. Says we should listen to her because her mother-in-law wrote something in a book. She left before he could say anything else. She walked home in the failing light, bare at her heels, and told herself she had done what she could. She had read the signs. She had given the warning. What people chose to do with it was not something she could control, but she thought about Wade Tanner's father, a man she had seen occasionally at the store, quiet and solid, with weather-roughened hands and a way of looking at the sky that suggested he had spent his whole life reading it. A man who probably knew, in the way that people who have worked land for decades know things, that this winter was different. She thought about him, and she couldn't quite let go of it. The storm came before dawn. There was no warning in the conventional sense, no building pressure, no shifting clouds, no gradual accumulation of signs that allowed for a comfortable period of preparation. 1 hour the night was cold and still, the stars clear and brilliant overhead. The next hour, the world disappeared. Sigrid heard it before she felt it. A sound like nothing she had heard before. Not wind exactly, but something that wind was doing that wind did not usually do. A sound that was alive and purposeful, the way a river sounds when it has decided to become a flood. It built for perhaps 30 seconds, and then it arrived all at once. The cabin shook, not severely, not dangerously, but it shook in the way that solid things shake when something enormous passes over them, and Sigrid was out of her bed before the sound had fully registered, moving to the children's corner, her hand on Leif's shoulder, her voice calm and even. Get up, get dressed, everything warm that you own. Britta was already sitting up, her eyes wide, but her jaw set with the particular steadiness that had been her father's most recognizable quality. Is it the storm grandmother wrote about? She asked. Yes, Sigrid said. She could hear it now beyond the walls. That shrieking howl, that roaring blank white darkness pressing against every surface of the cabin as if testing, as if looking for the place where it could get in. She moved quickly around the stove, feeding it carefully, building the fire to a steady heat that would last. She checked the wood supply inside. She checked the water. Then she pressed her hand against the nearest wall. The plaster was cool, but not cold. Not the killing cold that was screaming outside. The wall was holding. She stood with her hand flat against the plaster for one long moment, eyes closed. Trust them, Astrid had written. And when the storm comes, open your door. How long will it last? Leif asked. I don't know, she said, but we have enough. We have wood and food and walls that will hold. Whatever comes, we are ready. Bear pressed against her leg, warm and steady. And if it lasts longer than we have wood? Britta asked, not with panic, just with the careful precision of a girl who needed to understand the parameters of the problem. Then we will be very careful with what we have, Sigrid said, and we will be all right. She believed it. She had built those walls to believe it. On the second day, the temperature outside dropped to something she had never personally experienced. A cold that was not merely cold, but something more fundamental. A cold that changed the nature of the air itself, that made breathing feel like an act of courage. Inside the cabin, the air stayed breathable. The fire banked carefully, held the temperature in the range of the merely uncomfortable rather than the deadly. Sigrid rationed everything: wood, food, candles. She moved through the cabin with a quiet efficiency that she could feel the children watching, and she understood that the calmness she performed was itself a resource, that the children drew from it the way they drew warmth from the stove, and so she could not afford to let it falter. On the third day, she heard something that wasn't the storm. She pressed her ear against the south wall and listened. Past the roaring, past the shrieking, past the sound of snow compressing itself against the outer surfaces of the cabin in deep, heavy layers. Voices, human voices. She moved to the door. Leif was beside her in an instant, and she felt his hand on her arm, not pulling her back, just present, just there. She opened the door into a wall of white. The wind hit her like a physical blow, stole the breath from her lungs, and for a moment she could see nothing at all. Then the shapes resolved. 3 people, or 4, moving through the white with the desperate lurching motion of people who had been moving for a long time and were very nearly out of the strength to continue. She reached out and grabbed the first arm she could find. "Here!" she called into the roaring. "Follow my voice! Here!" They came in one by one, falling through the doorway and collapsing against the floor with the boneless relief of people who have given their last reserves to reach a destination they weren't certain existed. A young couple and their 2 children. The older child, a boy of perhaps 9, was conscious and shaking violently. The younger, a girl, 5 at the most, small and slight in her mother's arms, was not moving. Her skin was the color of old wax. Sigrid did not think. She moved. She took the child from the mother's arms and carried her to the stove, stripping away the frozen outer layers with careful, rapid movements, wrapping the small body in the warmed blanket she had been keeping folded on the chair beside the fire for exactly this possibility. She had not known she was preparing for this specifically, but she had known she was preparing, and the difference between those 2 things turned out to be nothing at all. She heated water. She held a cup to lips that were blue rather than pink and watched for any response. She rubbed the small hands between her own, gently, steadily, the way her mother had once taught her to bring warmth back to something that cold had claimed. The parents huddled against the wall. The mother was making sounds that weren't quite words. The father had the hollow expression of a man who has used up everything he had and does not yet know what comes next. "She's alive," Sigrid said. Not a question, an assertion. "She is alive. I need you to be calm for her." The mother pressed both hands over her mouth and nodded. It took 2 hours. 2 hours of careful, steady, unglamorous work. The warmth, the water, the slow rubbing of cold, stiffened limbs, the patient watching for signs of response. Britta kept the stove fed without being asked. Leif brought more blankets. Bear lay pressed against the child's side, his body heat a steady addition to everything else. His presence something that the child's body seemed to understand even before her mind did. When the girl's eyelids fluttered, the sound that came from her mother was something Sigrid would carry with her for the rest of her life. When the girl finally opened her eyes, pale blue, confused, focusing slowly on the unfamiliar ceiling of an unfamiliar cabin, she looked around until she found the dog. Bear had not moved from her side. He was watching her with his customary patient attention, his chin resting on the blanket near her feet. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she whispered, in a voice barely larger than a breath, "Is the dog cold?" The cabin went absolutely still. The mother made a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. The father put his face in his hands. Leaf looked at the floor. Britta, who had been so steadily composed for so long, pressed her lips together and blinked very fast. Sigrid looked at the little girl, alive, conscious, wondering about the dog, and felt something give way inside her that she hadn't known was braced against anything. "No, sweetheart," she said, when she could speak. "The dog is very warm." Bear's tail thumped once against the floor. He did not move otherwise. 19 people in that cabin. Not one of them made a sound. Think about that for a moment. 19 people, some of whom had mocked her, some who had threatened her, some who had simply looked away. All of them holding their breath over a question about a dog. That was the moment the storm stopped being only about survival. That was the moment it became something else. The family from the east had been inside barely an hour when the next knock came. And then another. And then, sometime later, another. They came in waves, in ones and twos and small shivering clusters, each arrival a version of the same story. A roof that had given way. A fire that had failed. A journey through white blindness that had lasted longer than anyone's strength should have permitted. Harlan Croft came on the fourth knock, supported on one side by his wife Agnes, and on the other by the oldest of their children, his leg bent at an angle below the knee that told Sigrid everything she needed to know before he said a word. His face was the color of old ash. His eyes, when they found hers, held something she had not expected to see there. He looked, for perhaps the first time in his life, like a man who was not sure he deserved to be helped. He didn't say anything when she stepped aside to let him in. He didn't say anything while she set his leg, a brutal, necessary act that required him to grip the wall and breathe through his teeth, while she worked with steady hands and the same focus she brought to everything that mattered. When it was done, he sat against the wall with his bound leg extended before him, and he looked at the walls of the cabin, smooth and intact and holding, while outside the world roared and tore at everything that hadn't been built to last. "How?" he said. Just a man sitting in the evidence of his own wrongness, asking the only question that was left. "Ashen clay," Sigrid said. "My husband's mother knew." He was quiet for a long time. Dr. Shaw arrived next, alone, coatless, his expression stripped of everything that education and position had given him to wear. He stood inside the doorway and looked at the crowded cabin, and then he looked at the walls, and Sigrid watched him work through something in his face that was too complicated to name. "The science should not allow this," he said, "to no one in particular." "And yet," Sigrid said. Reverend Holt came with his black coat white with ice, his Bible pressed against his chest. He stood in the doorway and looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. The expression of a man who has run out of the words he usually uses and has not yet found others to replace them. "Mrs. Voss," he said. His voice was unsteady. "I have nowhere else to go." She stepped aside. Conrad came last. He came alone. No lawyer, no documents, no careful coat. Just a man in the snow, with his usual armor stripped away by cold and wind and the particular democracy of a storm that did not care what anyone's legal claims were. He stood in the doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. For a moment, neither of them spoke, and in that silence, all the months of threat and counter-threat, all the documents and claims and carefully chosen words, seemed to reduce themselves to something much simpler. A man outside in the cold, and a woman standing at the threshold of something she had built herself, deciding what kind of person to be. She stepped aside. Conrad walked in. He found a corner. He sat down, and he looked at his hands, and he did not speak. The door closed behind him. The storm screamed on outside, enormous, indifferent, ancient. Inside, the walls held. She pressed her hand one more time against the nearest wall, feeling its solid warmth beneath her palm. The plaster did not give. It did not crack. It held. The way it had always held. The way she had always known it would. There were 19 people in a cabin built for 3. Sigrid looked at them in the first full hour after Conrad's arrival. Looked at all of them. This unlikely congregation gathered by cold and necessity into the space she had built with ash and clay and the stubbornness of someone who had nothing left to lose but her children. And she made a series of decisions so quickly and quietly that most of them didn't realize decisions were being made at all. She organized, not loudly, not with the performance of authority, which she had never possessed and had long since stopped wanting. She simply moved through the crowded cabin with the practical efficiency of a woman who had been solving problems in small spaces for as long as she could remember, and the problems arranged themselves before her, and she addressed them one by one. The children first. The young couple's boy, 9 years old, still shaking but conscious and improving, went beside Leaf, who was 14 and steady, and had the gift of being calming to smaller people without trying to be. The little girl, the one who had asked about the dog, was still wrapped in her warmed blanket by the stove. Bear had not moved from her side. Sigrid did not ask him to. The injured next. Harlan Croft's leg was set and bound, but he needed to be kept still and kept warm, and Agnes needed to be near him, and their older children needed to be somewhere they could see both parents. Sigrid rearranged the sleeping arrangements without asking anyone's permission, pointing people towards spots with the calm directness of someone who has no time for negotiation and no interest in conflict. Dr. Shaw, she put to work. You have medical training, she said to him, not as a question. He looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating something. Yes. Then use it. The woman in the corner. Her hands concern me. Look at them. He went. He did not ask whether she was serious or remind her of his credentials, or suggest that perhaps she was overstepping. He simply went, and Sigrid watched him go, and then turned to the next problem. Food. She had planned for 3 people through a long winter, which meant she had more than most cabins in the valley, but less than 19 people needed. She did the arithmetic quickly and quietly, and then went to the root cellar and stood in the cold underground dark for a moment, looking at what she had, thinking about what it needed to become. She came back up with her arms full. Britta, she said. Her daughter was already at her elbow, as if she had known she would be needed here before the word was spoken. The large pot, Sigrid said. Everything we have in the way of dried meat, the root vegetables, all of them. Make it stretch. How far? Sigrid looked at the 19 people in her cabin. As far as it needs to go. Britta nodded and went to work without another word. Leaf had taken over the woodpile management without being asked, moving between the stacked wood and the stove with the quiet efficiency of someone who has decided this particular task belongs to him and will not be surrendered. He counted what remained, divided it against the hours of the storm, and made adjustments, small, careful ones, that kept the temperature in the cabin at the edge of comfortable rather than the generous warmth he would have preferred. He was 14, and he was doing the mathematics of survival with a steadiness that made Sigrid's chest ache with something she didn't have a word for, pride, perhaps, and grief. The two of them had been traveling together so long now that she sometimes couldn't tell them apart. The hours moved strangely inside the storm. Outside, the world remained incomprehensible, that roaring, howling, living darkness pressing against every wall. But inside, time took on a different quality. Not slow, exactly. More like thick. Every small thing required more attention than it usually did. Every conversation was careful, measured, aware of itself in a way that ordinary conversation never was. The Croft family occupied one corner. Harlan lay with his bound leg extended, his wife Agnes beside him, their children arranged around them in a way that suggested they had spent a great deal of time finding comfort in proximity. Harlan did not speak much. He was a man accustomed to filling rooms with his certainty, and certainty was not something he currently possessed. He lay against the wall and looked at the plaster beside his head, the smooth gray-brown surface that should, by every account he had trusted, have been crumbling by now. And his expression was one Sigrid chose not to examine too closely. He would come to it in his own time, or he wouldn't. Either way, she had other things to attend to. Dr. Shaw had found his footing. It happened gradually, over the first several hours, the process of a man who has lost the armor of his credentials, discovering that underneath the armor there is still, actually, a doctor. He moved through the crowded cabin with a growing quietness, checking on the injured and the cold-shocked, asking questions in a voice that had lost its lecturing quality and found something more useful in its place. He worked on the woman with the damaged hands. Careful, methodical work, the kind that required all his attention. And when he was done, he sat back on his heels and looked up at Sigrid. "She'll keep them," he said. "Both of them." "Good," Sigrid said. He was quiet for a moment. "The walls," he said. "The temperature in here. I've been calculating. The heat retention is significantly beyond what I would have predicted." "Yes," Sigrid said. "I told you it would fail," he said simply, without the elaborate scaffolding of justification that wrong men often build around their admissions. "I was wrong. I would like to understand it properly, when this is over, if you would be willing to explain it." "When this is over," Sigrid said, "ask Britta. She knows the journal better than anyone." He nodded. He went back to his patients. The little girl's name was Ruth. Sigrid learned this from the mother, a young woman named Clara, who had found her way back to herself over the course of the first several hours, helped along by hot broth and the sight of her daughter sitting upright against Bear's warm flank, stroking his ears with a seriousness that suggested she was conducting an important assessment of his character. "She keeps asking if the dog has a name," Clara said, watching her daughter. "His name is Bear," Britta said from across the cabin. Ruth considered this information with the gravity of a 5-year-old who takes naming seriously. Then she appeared to find it acceptable, because she returned to her ear-stroking without comment. Bear sighed, long and satisfied, and his tail moved once against the floor. The sound of it made Leaf smile. A real smile, unguarded, the first one Sigrid had seen from him in what felt like a very long time. He was sitting with Ruth's older brother, teaching the boy a knot that Eric had taught him, and the normalcy of the scene, a 14-year-old teaching a 9-year-old a practical skill in the middle of an impossible storm, was so ordinary and so precious that Sigrid had to look away from it before it undid her completely. It was Agnes Croft who told Sigrid about the contractions. She said it quietly, in the way of a woman who has been managing something privately and has decided that privacy is no longer something she can afford. "How long?" Sigrid asked in the same quiet register. "Since yesterday morning." Agnes met her eyes. "It's early. By 3 weeks at least." Sigrid looked at her, at the tightness around her eyes, at the particular held quality of her breath, at the way she had been sitting that Sigrid had registered without consciously noting and now understood. "All right," Sigrid said. "Let's get you somewhere more comfortable." She rearranged the corner of the cabin with quiet efficiency, creating a space that was as private as 19 people in a small room could manage, which was not very private, but was something. She sent Britta for the extra blankets. She sent Leif to ask Dr. Shaw to come when he was available, phrasing it in a way that communicated urgency without causing panic in the room. She sent everyone else, diplomatically, to be interested in something else. Then she sat beside Agnes Croft, the wife of the man who had called her cabin a fool's grave, who had ridden past her work with contempt on his face and certainty in his voice. And she did what women have always done for each other in the spaces where no one else can go. It took many hours. The storm raged outside. The fire held inside. Dr. Shaw came and assessed and stayed, his presence a practical reassurance even before he needed to do anything. Sigrid moved between Agnes and the rest of the cabin, managing both without appearing to manage either, maintaining the careful equilibrium that kept 19 frightened people in a small space from becoming something less manageable. Harlan, in his corner, said nothing, but Sigrid caught him watching his wife, watching Sigrid, watching the walls of the cabin with an expression that had moved past confusion into something quieter and harder to name. The baby came at 3 a.m, when the storm was at its worst. The cry cut through everything, through the roaring wind, through the thick atmosphere of exhaustion and fear that had settled over the cabin's inhabitants, through all the complicated history of the people assembled within those 4 walls. It was the sound of something beginning, right in the middle of something that had felt, for days, like an ending. The cabin went silent. Every person in the room heard it and felt it do something to them, something that bypassed the rational mind entirely and went directly to the place where people are still, underneath everything, just creatures who need warmth and safety, and each other. Harlan Croft, who had not made a sound in hours, turned toward his wife's corner, toward the sound of his newborn child. Sigrid watched him try to get up. She watched him remember his leg. She watched him look around with the expression of a man searching for whatever came next, when all the things he had believed about himself turned out to be insufficient. Leif was there before Sigrid had to move. He crossed the cabin quietly and crouched beside Harlan. "Put your arm over my shoulders," he said. Harlan looked at him, at this boy, 14 years old, the son of the woman he had mocked, heir to the knowledge he had dismissed. Something shifted in his face. Then he put his arm over Leif's shoulders, and Leif helped him across the cabin to his wife's side, moving carefully, slowly, making nothing of it. Harlan looked at his newborn son. This small, furious, absolutely present creature who had arrived in the middle of the worst storm anyone in the valley could remember, inside the walls that the whole valley had been so certain would fail. And the sound he made was not something Sigrid could describe. Not words. Just the sound of a man being remade by something he was entirely unprepared for. Agnes looked up at Sigrid over her husband's bowed head. Her eyes held exhaustion and relief, and a gratitude that was too large for the moment and needed somewhere to go. "Thank you," she said. Sigrid shook her head. "Rest now." Conrad had not moved from his corner. Through all of it, the arrivals, the organizing, the child's recovery, the birth, he had sat in his chosen corner with his hands in his lap and his eyes on the middle distance, and he had not spoken to anyone, and no one had spoken to him. Not from deliberate exclusion, Sigrid thought, but because he occupied a particular kind of invisible space that people create around themselves when they are processing something too large to process quickly. She brought him broth at some point during the long night. He accepted it without speaking. She did not expect him to speak, and she did not fill the silence with anything. She set the cup in his hands and moved on to the next thing that needed doing. Later, much later, when most of the cabin was sleeping, she looked across the room and found him still awake, still looking at the walls, not at her, at the walls themselves, at the plaster that had held through everything the storm could offer, through cold and pressure and days of sustained assault, without a single crack. She understood what he was looking at. He was looking at evidence. It was deep in the night when Fletcher Ashworth appeared at Sigrid's elbow. She hadn't heard him cross the cabin. He moved quietly for a large man, which she had noticed before, and found, she realized, unexpectedly restful. Most people who wanted her attention announced themselves well in advance. Fletcher simply arrived, present and unhurried, offering whatever the moment seemed to need. He had spent the hours of the storm being useful in the practical, undemonstrative way that seemed to be his primary mode of existing in the world. He had reinforced the door against the wind without being asked. He had helped move the injured without requiring direction. He had spent an hour sitting with Ruth's father, a young man named Thomas who had been moving in and out of a shock-adjacent state since his arrival. Simply being present, not talking much, offering the particular comfort of a person who does not need the situation to be different than it is. Now he sat beside Sigrid in the quiet hour when most of the cabin was finally, fragilely asleep. The fire had settled to a steady glow. Bear was asleep against the wall, with Ruth curled against his side, and her brother's hand resting on the dog's back in sleep, as if even unconscious the boy wanted to maintain contact with something warm and trustworthy. Harlan's family slept in their corner. Dr. Shaw slept sitting up with his back against the wall, his chin on his chest. Conrad slept, or appeared to sleep, curled toward the wall with his coat pulled over him. 19 people breathing in the dark. Outside, the storm continued its enormous indifferent work. Fletcher looked at the wall across from them. Then he looked at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. "Not. Is the cabin all right?" "Not. Will the wood last?" "Not. What happens when this is over?" Just the question itself, aimed at her specifically, asking about her and only her. She realized, sitting in that moment, that it had been a very long time since anyone had asked her that question and meant only her. She looked at him, at the steadiness in his attention, which asked nothing of her except that she answer honestly. "Not yet," she said, "but I think I will be." He nodded, as if this were a perfectly satisfactory answer, as if not yet was a reasonable place to be, and he had no interest in rushing her past it. They sat together in the warm dark for a while without speaking, not because there was nothing to say, but because nothing needed to be said. The fire crackled softly. Someone shifted in their sleep across the room. Bear's ear twitched and settled. At some point, Fletcher's hand moved across the small space between them and rested near hers. Not on top, not claiming anything, just near, present, available. Sigrid looked at his hand. Then she looked at the fire. She turned her hand and let it rest against his. Neither of them moved for a long time. Outside, the storm began, very slowly, so slowly it was almost imaginary, to change. Not to stop, not yet, but something in its quality shifted, the way a held breath begins to change before it is finally released. The roaring had a different register to it, something that Sigrid, who had spent the last several days learning the storm's voice the way you learn the voice of something you are in close quarters with, recognized as a beginning of something rather than a continuation. She did not say anything about it. It was too early to say anything. She did not want to offer a hope that might not hold, but she felt it, and she thought, perhaps. Britta woke before anyone else in the gray pre-dawn of what might be the final day of the storm, and found her mother still sitting by the dying fire with her hand resting near Fletcher Ashworth's. She looked at this for a moment. Then she went quietly to the wood corner, selected 2 pieces of oak, and fed them to the stove without making any noise at all. When the fire had caught, she went to check on Ruth, still sleeping, still pressed against Bear's warm flank, and touched the girl's forehead lightly with the back of her hand. Cool. The right kind of cool. The cool of ordinary sleep rather than the cool of something wrong. Britta straightened up and looked around the cabin, at all the people her mother had let in from the cold, at the walls that had held them, at her brother asleep on his side with one arm flung over his eyes, at her mother sitting in the quiet dark with her hand near a good man's hand. She was 11 years old, and she understood more than 11 years usually taught a person, because the past several months had been an education of a particular and irreplaceable kind. She went back to her spot, wrapped herself in her blanket, and looked at the journal. Astrid's journal, with its reconstructed torn page now folded carefully inside the front cover, sitting on the shelf where it always sat. "When the storm comes," Astrid had written, "open your door." Britta looked at the door, at the 19 people sleeping in the warmth that ash and clay and her mother's stubborn faith had made possible. She thought, we did. The light, when it came differently than it had come for days. It came without the muffled, stormy quality that had made every dawn feel provisional, as if the light itself wasn't sure it was permitted to stay. It came clear and cold and absolute. The particular quality of winter light after a storm, when the world has been scoured clean of everything soft, and what remains is only the essential. Sigrid was already awake when it arrived. She had watched the darkness begin to lift, had watched the quality of the sound outside continue its slow change, the roaring diminishing by degrees, the howling losing its sustained pitch, the world outside beginning, tentatively, to be a world again rather than an absence. When she finally opened the door, the cold came in like a wall, sharp, immediate, honest, and beyond it was silence. A silence so complete after so many days of that enormous voice that it felt almost loud. The snow was deep, deeper than she had ever seen. It had buried the lower half of the cabin walls, swallowed the woodpile cover, smoothed the entire landscape into a single white expanse that had erased every familiar landmark. She looked at the valley, at what the storm had done to it, and she felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. Then she turned back inside to the 19 people beginning to wake in the warmth she had built, and she began to think about what came next. Act 5. What the Walls Remember. The valley emerged from the storm, the way something emerges from a long illness, slowly, uncertainly, blinking at the light as if unsure it deserved to be there. The snow was everywhere and absolute. It had remade the landscape into something unfamiliar, something that required relearning. The distances were wrong, the landmarks buried, the paths between one place and another reduced to guesswork and careful movement through white that came up to a grown man's waist in the open and higher in the drifts. The sky above it all was the particular blue that only comes after a storm has spent itself entirely. A blue so clear and cold, it looked like something that had never been touched. Sigrid stood in the doorway of the cabin for a long time that first morning, looking at it. Behind her, 19 people were waking slowly into the realization that they had survived. She could hear it happening. The particular quality of voices when relief has not yet fully arrived, but fear has finally, tentatively, begun to loosen its grip. The sound of children asking for things. The sound of adults exhaling. She let them have the moment. When she finally stepped back inside, she moved to the corner that had been empty since before dawn. Conrad had left while most of the cabin was still sleeping, moving quietly out into the new silence of the post-storm world. But he had left something on the table, a single piece of paper, folded once. She opened it. It was not a legal document. It was not the elaborate scaffolding of claims and counterclaims that he had built so carefully over the past months. It was a few lines in his handwriting, the precise, economical handwriting of a man who had spent his life choosing words carefully and had, perhaps for the first time, chosen them for a reason other than advantage. The deed is yours. The claim is withdrawn. There will be no further correspondence from my office on this matter. Below that, after a space, in handwriting that was slightly different, less controlled, as if written after a long pause. Eric chose well. I did not understand that until now. I am not certain I deserve to. That was all. No signature, no apology in the conventional sense, no performance of remorse, no request for forgiveness, no expectation of response. Just the facts of what he was doing, and one honest sentence about why it had taken him so long to do it. Some people, when they are finally seen clearly, choose to disappear rather than be known. Conrad had done what he could do. It would never be enough. He understood that. And perhaps that understanding, arriving too late, as it so often does, was its own kind of punishment. Sigrid read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in her hands for a moment, looking at the wall across from her, at the plaster that had held through everything, that had held 19 lives through the worst the sky had offered. She thought about Eric, about the way he had stood on this land and said, "We will build something here, something that lasts." About the fever that had come too fast and taken him before he could keep the promises he had made. She set the letter down on the table. She did not burn it. Not yet. She left it there for now, because some things needed to sit in the open air before you knew what to do with them. Wade Tanner found his way to the cabin before noon. He came alone. This boy who had always moved in a pack, who had needed an audience to feel brave. He came alone now, through the deep snow, moving with the effortful concentration of someone carrying something heavy that had no physical weight. He stopped outside the door. Sigrid had seen him coming from the window and had gone to the doorway to meet him, Bear at her side, the cold air moving between them. He looked worse than she had expected. Not from the storm. He was cold and tired, but physically intact. He looked like a young man who had aged several years in the past several days, and not in any way that would make him happy about it. "My father," he said. She had already heard. One of the men who had arrived during the storm had brought the news. Wade's father had gone out to check on the animals when the storm was at its worst. He had not come back. "I know," she said. "I'm sorry." Wade looked at the ground between them. His jaw was working in the way of someone who has something to say and has not yet decided whether to say it. "I told everyone your cabin would fall apart," he said finally. "I bet money on it." He swallowed. "I told my father you were—" He stopped. "He thought you might be right about the storm. He told me that morning, before he went out. He said he thought you might know something." His voice cracked on the last word just slightly before he controlled it. "I told him he was being foolish." The silence between them held the weight of what that meant. Sigrid looked at this boy. Because he was a boy, she could see it clearly now. A boy who had been performing a kind of manhood that had nothing to do with the real thing, and who was now standing in the ruins of that performance with no idea what came next. She thought about what she could say. There were true things available to her that would have been satisfying to say. She did not say any of them. "You were 19, she said. "You believed what the men around you told you to believe. That is what young people do." She paused. "What you do now, that is the part that's yours." He looked up at her. His eyes were red in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. "Come inside," she said. "Eat something." He came in. He sat in the corner Conrad had vacated, and he ate what Britta brought him, and did not say anything for a long time. Britta, who had watched her mother be mocked by this young man, brought him the food without comment and without coldness. She set it in front of him and went back to what she had been doing. Sigrid watched this and felt something settle in her chest that might have been the beginning of peace. The process of returning people to their homes took 3 days. The valley had to be crossed on foot, in relays, the paths broken through the snow by the men and older boys who had the strength for it. Harlan Croft could not walk on his bound leg, but directed the operation from a makeshift sled that Leaf and Fletcher constructed from 2 planks and a length of rope, with the focused efficiency of people who have discovered they work well together. Dr. Shaw moved between households, assessing, treating, making notes with the intent expression of a man who has decided to understand what he previously dismissed. The damage was extensive. 3 roofs had collapsed entirely under the weight of snow. 4 more had partially failed. The church had lost 2 of its 3 windows and a section of the east wall. The general store had survived structurally, but lost its entire front porch, which had been torn away by the wind. Sigrid's cabin had not a single crack. People came to look at it. Not as pilgrims exactly, but with the particular attention of people who are trying to understand something that has displaced what they thought they knew. They ran their hands along the walls, looking for a weakness that wasn't there. They knocked on the plaster and listened to the sound it made. Solid, dry, certain. They looked at the gap at the top of each wall section, stuffed with dried grass, and asked questions that Britta answered with the patient precision of an 11-year-old who has decided that education is her vocation. 1 part ash to 3 parts clay, she said over and over to whoever asked. You wet the wood first. The wood accepts the plaster. They become one thing. She had her grandmother's journal open beside her when she said it, and she touched the page as she spoke, and the gesture was not lost on anyone watching. The reckoning with Harlan Croft was quieter than Sigrid had expected, and more complete. He came to her on the 4th day after the storm, moving carefully on a crutch that Fletcher had shaped for him, a good one, properly fitted to his height, because Fletcher did not make things badly, even for people he had no particular reason to help. Harlan came without Agnes, without his children, without the apparatus of his authority. He stood in front of the cabin and looked at the walls for a long moment. Then he looked at her. I called this place a fool's grave, he said. I said it in front of men who repeated it to other men, and it became what the valley believed about you before you'd had a chance to prove anything. He stopped. His voice had the rough quality of someone unaccustomed to this particular kind of speech. My grandchild was born in here. My leg is mended because of you. My family is alive because these walls held. He paused again. I was wrong about you. I was wrong about all of it. I don't know how to say that in a way that's adequate to what it cost you, so I won't try to find one. I'll just say it plain. Sigrid looked at him, at this large, weathered, formerly certain man standing in the snow with a crutch under his arm and no performance left in him. Teach me, he said, when my leg heals. Teach me to build the way you build. My cabin needs to be rebuilt from the foundation. I want to do it right this time. Come in the spring, Sigrid said. Bring your sons. He nodded. He turned and made his careful way back through the snow. She watched him go. This man, who had spent 28 years learning this valley, and had, in the end, learned the most important thing from a woman he had called a fool. There is something worth holding on to in that. Something about what it means to finally, however late, decide to do better. Some debts, Sigrid understood, could not be paid in words. The paying happened in what came after. Dr. Shaw came the following week, with his careful questions and a manner that had been substantially altered by days of evidence he could not dismiss. He sat across from Britta at the table and asked questions with the genuine humility of a man who has discovered that the shape of his ignorance is larger than he had believed. Britta answered him with patient precision. She explained the chemistry as Astrid had recorded it, the properties of hardwood ash, the behavior of clay in varying temperatures, the mechanics of why a wall needed to breathe. She was 11, and she spoke with the authority of someone who has spent months learning one subject thoroughly. At the end, he looked at the journal. May I? He asked. Britta glanced at her mother. Sigrid nodded. He handled it carefully, turning the pages with the attention of someone who has been taught to respect old things. This is engineering, he said quietly. Centuries of empirical observation recorded in a format that my training never taught me to recognize as legitimate. He looked up. I owe you an apology, Mrs. Voss. I told you this would fail. I was certain, and I was completely wrong. He paused. I would like to write about it. With your permission. Sigrid considered this. Write about the knowledge, she said. Write about Astrid. She deserves to be remembered. He wrote it. It took him several months, and he brought drafts to Britta for correction, which Britta provided with the frank editorial honesty of a child who has not yet learned to soften criticism unnecessarily. The final document was accurate and thorough, and gave full credit to its sources. To the women who had discovered and preserved and transmitted this knowledge across generations, without laboratories or formal recognition of any kind. Reverend Holt's reckoning happened in front of everyone. He stood before his congregation on the first Sunday after the storm had ended and delivered a sermon that no one who heard it would remember in its specifics, but everyone would remember in its quality. The quality of a man who has had his certainties broken open by experience and has decided to examine what was inside them rather than simply rebuild the shell. He spoke about knowledge and about the forms it comes in. He spoke about the walls of a cabin that had held 19 people through the worst the winter could offer, built by a woman he had questioned and a knowledge he had called suspect. He looked at Sigrid, who sat in the back pew with her children on either side of her and Fletcher Ashworth at the end of the row, and he said, I was wrong to doubt you. I was wrong to let my doubt become the community's doubt, without questioning whether I had earned the right to that much influence. It was not a perfect apology. Perfect apologies were rare in Sigrid's experience, and she had learned to recognize the genuine ones not by their perfection, but by what they cost the person making them. This one cost him something. She could see it. She accepted it accordingly. Spring came the way spring always came in that country. Not gently, not all at once, but in argument with the winter, advancing and retreating, offering warmth and then snatching it back, until finally the balance tipped and the snow began its slow surrender to the mud and the green and the impossible insistence of things that wanted to grow. Fletcher proposed on an afternoon in early spring, when the first mud was showing through the snow near the south wall, and the creek had begun to murmur again beneath its thinning ice. He did not make a speech. He was not a man who made speeches. He found her at the woodpile. She was always at the woodpile or somewhere near it. There was always something to do. And he stood beside her for a moment in the way he had learned she liked, without requiring anything of the silence. Then he said, I think you know what I'm going to ask. She set down the piece of wood she was holding. She looked at him, at the steadiness he had offered so consistently through everything, the quality of his attention that asked nothing of her except that she be exactly who she was. I think I do, she said. Leaf has already told me yes, Fletcher said. In case that matters to you. He told you yes? He said. Fletcher paused, and something crossed his face that might have been the suppressed version of a smile. He said you needed someone to keep the door hinges in good repair, and he had enough to do already. Sigrid laughed. It came out of her unexpectedly, the way laughter sometimes does when you have been too serious for too long, genuine and surprised and entirely her own. What did Britta say? She asked when she had collected herself. Britta said she would need to think about it. Fletcher's expression was composed, but his eyes held something warm. She spent 2 days thinking about it, and then she came to the forge and asked me 14 questions, And at the end of the 14th question, she said she found my answers satisfactory. Sigrid looked at him for another moment. Then she reached out and took his hand. The hand of a man who fixed things without being asked and moved quietly in rooms where other people were speaking, and had come through a storm to make sure children he did not yet have the right to call his were safe. Yes, she said. The answer is yes. The wedding was small because both of them wanted it that way. It happened inside the cabin. Because where else would it happen? Britta said, with the practical logic of someone for whom the answer is obvious. With Leif and Britta as witnesses, and Bear asleep in his spot by the door, his ear twitching occasionally at the sounds of celebration in the way of a creature who has decided that if no one is in danger, he can afford to rest. Harlan Croft came to learn in the spring, as he had promised. He brought both his sons, strong young men, skeptical in the way of people who have inherited their father's confidence without yet acquiring his recent education. He came on the day he could walk without the crutch. She taught him as Astrid had taught, through demonstration, through repetition, through the patient building of understanding that comes from doing rather than hearing. She showed him the ratio. She showed him the wetting of the wood, the scoring of the first coat, the gap at the top stuffed with dried grass. She showed him how to test a hardened sample, how to feel for the difference between a mixture that was right and one that wasn't. His sons watched their father being taught by a woman, and in watching, learned two things simultaneously: the method and something more important about what it meant to be wrong and continue anyway. By the end of that summer, a number of cabins in the valley had been rebuilt using the ash clay method. The knowledge moved the way it had always moved, from one pair of hands to another, from one household to the next, the way Astrid had described it, moving through the generations that had preceded her, the way it had traveled across an ocean in a cracked leather journal and arrived, against all probability, in exactly the place it was needed. Nora Lindqvist built her cabin wall by wall, learning as she went, and taught her daughter at the same time, both of them working side by side through the late summer afternoons with the ease of people who have found the thing they are going to keep. Britta taught the children who came to her, because children came to her, drawn by some quality she had that Sigrid recognized as the essential quality of a teacher, the ability to make the person being taught feel that the knowledge was already inside them and only needed finding. She taught them in the cabin, with the journal open on the table, translating Astrid's words into language that children could carry home and use. She was 11 years old and had already found her life's work. Leif grew in ways that were harder to measure than height. He was quieter than he had been before the winter, in the way of someone who has thought seriously about something and arrived at conclusions that have changed the texture of his thinking. He worked alongside Fletcher in the forge sometimes, learning with the same methodical patience he had applied to everything his mother had asked of him. He came to her one evening at the end of the summer and told her he wanted to study law. She had not expected it, and then she had, because of course, this was where Leif was going. The boy who had stood in front of Conrad Voss and said, "No," alone, without telling anyone, because it was the right thing to do, and he had done it without a framework that would have helped him understand why. He needed the framework. He wanted to build it. "There are widows in this valley," he said, "and in other valleys, who are losing land that belongs to them because they don't have anyone to stand beside them in a room where the law is being used against them. He looked at her. I want to be the person who stands there. Sigrid looked at her son for a long time. Your grandmother would have been proud of you, she said. Your father, too. He nodded. He went back to what he had been doing, carrying the plan inside him with the quiet steadiness that had always been his most Eric-like quality. It was in the last weeks of that autumn, nearly a full year after Sigrid had first found the ash bucket overturned in the red clay of the creek bank, that she found the letter. She was going through the journal, as she often did, running her fingertips along the pages the way you touch something you want to memorize. Britta had restored the torn page to its proper place, carefully mounted on a piece of clean cloth, the tiny fragments fitted together with the patience of a child who had decided that some things deserved to be made whole. Behind the journal's back cover, not inside it, but behind it, in the small gap between the leather binding and the board beneath, her fingers found something that had no business being there. A folded piece of paper, thin and soft with age, pressed so flat against the board that it had been invisible unless you were specifically looking. She pulled it out carefully. She opened it. The handwriting was Eric's. She recognized it immediately, the way you recognize a voice before you understand the words. That particular slant, the way he made his letters, the small idiosyncrasies that she had spent years learning without knowing she was learning them. He had written it before he died. She did not know exactly when, but the paper had the quality of something written in urgency, in the compressed time of a person who understands that time is compressing. Sigrid, Mama asked me to give you the journal when you were ready for it. I kept waiting for the right moment. I think I kept waiting because I knew that giving it to you meant telling you about the page I removed, and I was afraid you would be frightened by what it said. I was wrong to wait. I should have trusted you from the beginning. You were always the stronger of the two of us. I knew it when I married you, and I have known it every day since. I just didn't always know how to say it. The knowledge in that journal is yours now. It was always meant to be yours. Mama knew that. I think I knew it too, in the end. Build well. The walls will hold. I love you. I love our children. Take care of them the way only you know how. Eric Sigrid sat with the letter in her hands for a very long time. The fire crackled. Bear breathed slowly in his sleep by the door. Somewhere in the valley, the last of the summer's warmth was finishing its work before yielding to autumn, and the process of preparation, the endless, patient, necessary process of building against what was coming, was already underway again. She read the letter twice, then a third time. Then she folded it with careful hands and held it against her chest for a moment and let herself cry. Quietly, without performance, the way you cry for things that are genuinely gone and will not come back. And the crying is not about fixing anything, but only about acknowledging what was real. After a while, she dried her face. She went to the shelf and set the letter inside the journal's front cover, beside the restored torn page, where the two things could be together. The warning and the love. Astrid's knowledge and Eric's voice. The old world and the new one. All of it held in the same battered leather cover that had traveled so far to arrive in exactly this place. She looked at the walls around her, at the smooth gray-brown plaster that had held through the worst the world had offered. Ash doesn't argue with cold, she said quietly, to the cabin, to the walls, to the journal on the shelf, to the man whose handwriting she had just been holding. Ash remembers. The years that came after were not without difficulty. No years are. But they had a different quality to them. The quality of things built on the right foundation, which is not the same as things built on easy ground. Leaf became what he had said he would become. He went to study law, came back changed in ways that had made him more himself rather than less, and spent the better part of his working life standing beside women in rooms where the law was being used against them. He was not always successful. The law was imperfect, and the men who administered it were human, and justice was a thing you worked toward rather than arrived at. But he was present. He stood there. That turned out to matter more than he had expected. Britta became a teacher. She never stopped. She taught the ash clay method for the rest of her life, and she taught reading and arithmetic and the old language and the names of plants and the behavior of animals before a storm. And she told her students about Astrid, always about Astrid, the woman who had written down what she knew because she understood that knowledge does not keep itself alive, that someone has to carry it forward deliberately, with intention, and pass it to the next pair of hands. The students carried it. Their students carried it after them. Bear lived 17 years, long past what anyone expected, as if he had decided that his work was not finished, and had made arrangements accordingly. He died in his sleep, on his rug beside the stove. In the way of a creature that has spent its life doing exactly what it was built to do and finished without regrets. They buried him beneath the apple tree that Fletcher had planted. A seedling carried carefully from the eastern settlements, tended through 2 hard winters before it took. Britta carved the stone herself, with the focused attention she brought to things that deserved to be done properly. Bear, it read. He kept watch until the end. Sigrid visited the grave most mornings for the rest of her life. She brought her coffee and stood beneath the apple tree and talked to the dog who could no longer hear her about the weather and the grandchildren and the small, ordinary news of a life that continued to be worth living. She did not find this strange. She had spent enough time now with the knowledge that some things remain present in ways that cannot be fully explained, and she had learned to accept that as information rather than confusion. She grew old in the cabin she had built. She grew old slowly and not unhappily, in the way of people whose work has meaning and whose company is good. Fletcher's hands remained steady for many years, and then they became steady and slow. And then one winter he did not wake from his sleep, and that was the winter that was hardest. But she had the children, and the grandchildren, and the great-grandchildren who arrived in due course, and were, each of them, introduced to the journal and to the walls of the cabin and to the story of the woman who had mixed ash and clay by accident and changed the course of everything. One evening in the last autumn of her life, a small girl, her granddaughter's youngest, 7 years old, with eyes that were Eric's eyes, sat beside her on the porch and looked at the cabin walls in the fading light. "Grandma," she said, "were you scared when the storm came?" Sigrid looked at her hands, old now, gnarled with arthritis, but still the hands that had pressed ash and clay into the gaps between logs and made something that held. "Every single day," she said, "but the walls never were." The girl considered this. "Will you teach me?" she asked. Sigrid looked at her granddaughter's child, this small, serious, curious person sitting beside her in the autumn light, already leaning forward slightly in the way of someone ready to learn. "Yes, my darling," she said, "I will teach you everything." In the years that followed, the long years of after, when the people who had lived the story became the people who told it, the cabin remained standing. It stood through seasons and decades, through changes that remade the valley around it while leaving it essentially itself, as things built on the right foundation tend to remain themselves even as everything changes. The walls never cracked. People came to look at them occasionally, drawn by the story that had passed from person to person the way the knowledge itself had passed. From hand to hand, from generation to generation, carried forward by people who understood that some things are too important to be forgotten. They ran their palms along the plaster and felt its solidity, its warmth, the particular quality of something made to last. And sometimes, in the quiet of an empty cabin, or the hush of an early morning, you could almost hear it. Ash doesn't argue with cold. Ash remembers.